The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was tucked neatly inside my mailbox between a power bill and a grocery flyer, printed on thick white paper with the bold blue logo of Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association stamped across the top like it was some kind of official government document. At first, I thought it was another newsletter. You know the type. Reminders about trash day. Complaints about lawn height. Some overly enthusiastic announcement about a neighborhood barbecue nobody actually attends. But when I opened it, I realized this one was different. Right in the center of the page was a bold line that read, "Notice of violation, $600 fine." I blinked. $600. For a moment, I honestly thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe they mixed up addresses. Maybe someone parked wrong. Maybe it was about the shed I built 2 years ago. But then I read the reason listed underneath. And that's when I laughed. Out loud. Standing right there in my mailbox. Because according to the HOA, I had been illegally fishing in a restricted community water feature. Let me explain something. The restricted community water feature they were talking about was the lake in my backyard. Not near my backyard. Not visible from my backyard. Actually in it. My property backs directly onto Silverwood Lake, a huge, quiet body of water that had been there long before the neighborhood developers ever showed up with their identical houses and community guidelines. I bought my house 12 years ago specifically because of that lake. Early mornings with a fishing rod. Sunrise over the water. Base breaking the surface. It was the reason I moved there in the first place. But apparently, the HOA had decided that the lake was now community-managed recreational property, which meant residents needed permits. And according to the letter, I didn't have one.
So they fined me
$600 for fishing in the lake behind my own house. I read the letter again just to be sure I wasn't missing something.
Nope. Clear as day.
It even included 2 grainy photos attached at the bottom. Pictures taken from across the water. One of me sitting in a lawn chair with a fishing rod. The other of a small base I just pulled out of the lake. Underneath the photos was a neat little caption. Evidence of unauthorized fishing activity. I shook my head. There's something special about HOA confidence. The kind that makes people believe they can regulate things they've never actually owned. Still, I figured this was probably just a misunderstanding. So later that afternoon, I walked down to the HOA office. It was a small building next to the community pool. Glass doors. Fake stone walls. A big decorative sign that said Lakeside Ridge Community Center. Inside sat the HOA president.
Karen.
Yes, her real name. Late 40s. Sharp haircut. Always dressed like she was about to attend a city council meeting. She looked up as I walked in. Can I help you? I set the letter on her desk. I got this fine today. She glanced at it and nodded immediately.
Yes.
Unauthorized fishing. You mean fishing in the lake behind my house? Correct. I waited for the punchline. None came. So I asked the obvious question. You know that lake isn't owned by the HOA, right? Karen leaned back in her chair. The HOA manages the lake as a community recreational asset. That's not what I asked. She folded her hands together. The lake is included in the neighborhood development plan. Management isn't ownership, I said calmly. Her smile tightened slightly. Well, regardless, fishing privileges require a permit purchase through the HOA. And if I don't buy one, the fine remains in effect. $600. For fishing in water I'd been using for over a decade. I picked the letter back up. You're sure about this? Absolutely, she said confidently. Good. Because right at that moment, an idea started forming in my head. And if Karen had known who actually owned the lake she was trying to regulate, she probably would have thought twice before sending that letter. But she didn't, which meant things were about to get very interesting. Before we get into how the HOA accidentally pushed me into buying something that changed the entire neighborhood overnight, make sure you're subscribed, because the moment Karen realized who actually controlled that lake became one of the most satisfying HOA meltdowns I've ever witnessed. And it all started with that ridiculous $600 fine. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the violation letter spread out in front of me. Next to it sat my laptop. And on the screen was something most HOA boards never bother checking before they start making rules about things. Property records. Now, I already knew the basic story of Silverwood Lake. When the neighborhood was built about 15 years ago, the developer had marketed the homes as lakefront properties. It sounded great in brochures. People loved the idea of kayaking, fishing, and sunset views. But what most homeowners never realized was that the developer didn't actually own the lake. They had simply built houses around it. The lake itself had been privately owned farmland decades earlier, then passed through a few different investment groups before eventually landing in the hands of a small regional land holding company. And for the last 10 years, that company had basically ignored it. No development, no maintenance, just taxes and the occasional fishing boat drifting through, which meant something very important. The HOA didn't own it. They didn't manage it. And they definitely didn't have the legal authority to fine anyone for using it. But that didn't mean they believed that. HOAs have a special talent for confusing confidence with ownership. So the next morning, I made a phone call. I tracked down the contact information for the land holding company listed in the county records. A guy named Martin answered. Silver Ridge Holdings.
Hi, I said.
I'm calling about Silverwood Lake. There was a pause. Oh wow, he said. Nobody's asked about that property in years. That was a good sign. I live in the neighborhood bordering it, I explained. I was curious if the lake is still owned by your company. Technically, yes, he replied. Technically? Well, we've actually been looking to offload it. Now my interest really kicked in. Offload it how? Sell it. The land around the lake, the shoreline, water rights, everything. I leaned back in my chair. And nobody's bought it yet? Honestly, he said, chuckling, most buyers don't want a lake surrounded by suburban HOA houses. Fair point. But to me, it sounded perfect. How big is the property exactly? I asked. About 42 acres total. 42 acres. Right in the middle of a neighborhood where houses were selling for nearly $500,000. My mind started doing math. Do you have an asking price? He hesitated. Well, we originally listed it at $750,000 years ago, but we've lowered expectations since then. I stared at the HOA violation letter sitting on the table. $600. For fishing. I might be interested, I said. Martin sounded surprised. Seriously? Possibly. But I'd need to know the full boundaries and rights included. No problem, he said. I can send over the survey documents. Within 10 minutes, an email landed in my inbox. I opened the files.
Maps.
Legal descriptions. Shoreline boundaries. Boat access rights. And then I saw the most interesting detail of all. The lake didn't just include the water. It included every inch of shoreline around it, including the strip directly behind all the HOA houses, which meant something incredible.
If someone owned that lake,
they controlled the shoreline access, fishing access, boat launching, dock permissions, everything, including the part directly behind my backyard. I zoomed in on the survey map. The HOA neighborhood sat like a horseshoe around the lake. But legally speaking, the water and shoreline in the middle belonged to one single owner, whoever bought it. And at that moment, the HOA had absolutely no idea the property was even for sale. I leaned back and looked at the violation letter again. $600. For fishing. Karen probably thought she was teaching me a lesson about HOA authority. Instead, she'd accidentally introduced me to the most interesting real estate opportunity in the entire neighborhood. So later that afternoon, I called Martin back. I have a question, I said.
Sure.
If someone bought the lake, could they control fishing access? Of course. And shoreline use? Yes. And technically ban trespassing from surrounding properties? Absolutely. I smiled. Good. Because suddenly, that $600 fine felt like the best investment advice I'd ever received. And Karen had no idea what she'd just started. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't mention the lake to anyone. Not the neighbors. Not the HOA. Not even the guy who lived 2 houses down and spent every Saturday morning kayaking across the water behind my yard. Instead, I focused on one thing: due diligence. Buying 42 acres of water surrounded by a suburban neighborhood wasn't exactly a casual purchase. Even if the price had dropped from its original listing, it was still a serious investment. But the more I researched, the more interesting the situation became. Silverwood Lake wasn't just a scenic pond. It had legal water rights, documented shoreline ownership, and registered environmental protections that actually prevented the HOA, or anyone else, from altering it without the owner's permission. Which meant the person who owned that lake effectively controlled one of the most valuable natural features in the entire neighborhood. And right now, that owner could be me. Martin sent over additional paperwork, historical surveys, tax records, access easements. I spent several evenings reading through everything line by line. There were only 2 official access points to the lake. One was a small gravel boat ramp on the north side. The other was a narrow maintenance path used years ago by the original farm owners. Neither of those access points were owned by the HOA. Both were included in the property being sold, which meant something else important. If the lake changed hands, anyone using it without permission could legally be considered trespassing. That included fishing, kayaking, dock installations, even those little paddle boats I'd seen drifting around during summer weekends. Technically, all of it depended on the lake owner's approval. And suddenly, the HOA's $600 fine looked even more ridiculous. Because they weren't regulating something they owned. They were regulating something that didn't belong to them at all. 3 days later, I drove out to meet Martin in person. He was exactly what I expected. Mid-50s, relaxed, the kind of guy who managed land assets rather than actively developing them. We met at a small office about 30 minutes away. He laid the property folder on the table between us. "So," he said, "you're serious about the lake?" "I am." He nodded slowly. "I have to admit, this one's been sitting for a long time. Developers looked at it, but the surrounding houses made expansion difficult." "Sounds like their problem," I said. He chuckled. "Fair point." We went through the numbers. Property taxes, insurance, environmental restrictions, maintenance expectations. Then we talked price. Like he said earlier, the original listing had been $750,000. But the reality of selling a lake surrounded by HOA homes had lowered their expectations. A serious offer around $430,000 would probably close the deal, he said. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about the neighborhood, the boats, the docks, the kids fishing from the shore, and most importantly, the HOA president confidently handing out fines for something she had absolutely no authority over. Finally, I said, "Would your company accept $400,000 if we close quickly?" Martin leaned back in his chair. He thought for maybe 5 seconds. Then he smiled. "I think we could make that work."
Just like that.
$400,000. For the entire lake. 42 acres of water and shoreline sitting right in the center of the neighborhood. We shook hands. And 2 weeks later, the paperwork was finished. The county updated the property records. And Silverwood Lake officially had a new owner.
Me.
The first thing I did wasn't dramatic. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't send letters. I didn't post announcements. Instead, I walked down to the shoreline behind my backyard early one morning with a cup of coffee and a brand new fishing rod. The sun was rising over the water, the same way it had for the past 12 years. Except now, something had changed. Because legally speaking, that lake was no longer community recreational property. It was private property. My private property. And the HOA president who fined me $600 for fishing? She was about to learn that the rules of the lake had just changed completely. I didn't rush the announcement. Owning the lake gave me control, but timing gave me leverage. So for the first few days, I simply watched. From my backyard deck, I could see almost the entire southern side of Silverwood Lake. The water was calm most mornings, broken only by the occasional ripple from someone paddling a kayak or casting a fishing line from the shoreline. And just like always, the HOA residents treated the lake like it belonged to them.
Announcement.
A couple walked their dog along the
Owning
bank.
the lake
2
gave
teenagers
me
paddled
control,
a bright red kayak across
but
the middle.
timing
And
gave
one
me
afternoon,
leverage.
I saw something that made me
So
laugh.
for the first
Karen
few
herself.
days, I
She was
simply
standing on a
watched.
small wooden dock behind one of the
From my
lakeside homes,
backyard
holding a
deck,
clipboard
I could
and talking
see
to 2
almost the
residents while
entire
pointing out across the
southern
water,
side of
like a tour
Silverwood
guide
Lake.
explaining neighborhood amenities. The irony was
The
incredible
water was calm
because at
most
that exact
mornings,
moment, she was literally
broken
standing on the
only
edge of
by the
property she had
occasional
zero authority
ripple
over.
from someone
But that was about to
paddling a
change.
kayak
2 days
or
later, the
casting a
official
fishing
paperwork from the
line
county
from
finished
the
processing.
shoreline.
Silverwood Lake now
And
showed
just
up
like
in the public property
always,
database under
the
my name.
HOA
That's when I made the
residents
next move.
treated the
I
lake
contacted
like
a
it
local
belonged
property
to
management
them.
company that specialized in
couple
private land
walked their
signage and
dog
shoreline
along the
boundary
bank.
markers. By Friday morning, a small
Two
truck arrived with
teenagers
3 workers
paddled a
and a
bright
stack of
red
metal signs.
kayak across
Bright
the
white
middle.
background, bold red
And
letters.
one afternoon,
The message was
I saw
impossible to
something that
misunderstand.
made me laugh.
Private property, lake
Karen
access restricted,
herself.
authorized use only.
She was
We placed the
standing on a
first sign at the
small
north boat
wooden
ramp,
dock
the second
behind
at the
one of
maintenance
the
access
lakeside
path,
homes,
and the third directly behind my
holding
backyard
a
where the shoreline
clipboard,
curved toward the neighborhood.
and talking
Within
to
2
two
hours,
residents
people started
while
noticing.
pointing out
The first
across
reaction
the
came from the
water
guy
like
who
a
usually
tour
kayaked
guide,
every weekend. He
explaining
paddled up to the shoreline,
neighborhood amenities.
stared at the sign for a moment, then
The
pulled out his
irony
phone
was
and started taking
incredible.
pictures. Half an hour later,
Because at
2 more
that
residents
exact
walked down to read
moment,
it. By late afternoon,
she was
word had
literally
clearly
standing
reached
on the
HOA
edge
board,
of property
because
she
right around
had zero
sunset,
authority
Karen showed
over.
up. She marched straight down the path
But
behind
that
my
was
house
about to
like
change.
she was about to write someone a citation.
2 days
When
later,
she reached the sign, she stopped.
the
Read it
official
once,
paperwork
then again.
from the county
Then she spotted me
finished
sitting in a chair near the
processing.
water with my fishing rod.
Silverwood
Her
Lake
face
now
tightened
showed
immediately.
up in the public
She walked straight
property
over.
database
What is this?
under my name.
I calmly reeled in my line.
That's when I
Signage.
made the next
You
move.
can't restrict lake access,
I
she snapped.
contacted a local
This is a community
property
lake.
management
I pointed
company
toward the
that
sign.
specialized
Not anymore.
In private
Her
land
expression shifted from
signage and
annoyance to
shoreline
confusion.
boundary
What are you talking about?
markers.
I set the fishing
By
rod down
Friday
and
morning,
reached into the
a
folder
small
sitting beside my
truck
chair.
arrived with
Inside were
3
copies of the
workers
county
and
property
a stack
records,
of metal
the same ones
signs.
finalized 2 days earlier.
Bright
I
white
handed her the top
background.
sheet. This is what I'm talking
Bold
about.
red
Karen
letters.
stared at the document. At
The
first,
message
her
was
eyes moved slowly
impossible
across
to
the page.
misunderstand.
Then they stopped. Her eyebrows
Private
pulled together.
property,
She
lake
read the owner name
access
again.
restricted,
Then she looked up at me.
authorized
You
use
bought the lake?
only.
Yep.
We
Her mouth
placed
opened
the
slightly.
first
You're
sign at
serious?
The north boat
County records are
ramp.
public, I said.
The second
Feel free to
at
verify.
The maintenance
She looked back
access
down at the
path.
paper, like she was
And
hoping the
third
words would
directly
change.
behind
They didn't.
my backyard,
For the first time since
where
I'd
the
ever dealt with
shoreline
the HOA,
curved
Karen
toward
looked
the
completely
neighborhood.
unprepared. But
Within
residents
2
have been using the
hours,
lake for years.
People started
Without permission,
noticing.
I replied. This
the
is
first
outrageous.
reaction came from
I
the
shrugged.
guy who
You find me
usually
$600 for
kayaked
fishing
every
here.
weekend.
Her face turned red.
He
That
paddled
was because
up
he
to
didn't
the
have a permit.
shoreline,
I smiled.
stared
now
at
no
the
one
sign
does.
for a moment.
For a few seconds,
then
neither of
pulled
us
out
said
his
anything.
phone and
Behind
started
Karen,
taking
2
pictures.
homeowners had wandered down to see what the
Half
argument
an
was
hour
about.
later,
One of them read the sign,
2
then
more
looked at Karen.
residents walked
Wait,
down
the
to
lake
read
is private
it.
now.
By
Karen
late
didn't answer,
afternoon,
because technically,
word had
it always had
clearly
been.
reached
The only difference
HOA
now was that the
board.
owner actually lived right next to it.
Because
And
right
unlike the
around
previous
sunset,
owners, I was paying attention.
Karen showed
finally
up.
handed the papers back.
She marched
This isn't over,
straight
she said.
down the path
I nodded
behind
calmly.
my house.
You're right. Then I picked
Like
up my
she was
fishing
about
rod again.
to write
But for
someone
now,
a citation.
I cast the line back into the water.
When she reached
the lake
the
is closed.
sign,
Karen
she
tried to fight
stopped.
it. Of course she did.
Read
Within
it
3 days of
once.
the signs going up, the
Then
HOA
again.
sent out a long
Then
neighborhood
she
email
spotted
titled
me sitting
Important
in a
update
chair
regarding
near the
Silverwood
water
Lake
with
access.
my fishing rod.
I got a copy forwarded to
Her
me
face
by 3 different
tightened
neighbors.
immediately.
The message claimed the HOA was
She
reviewing
walked
legal
straight
options
over.
and advised residents to continue
What is
normal
this?
recreational use until further notice,
Karen tried to
which was an
fight
interesting
it.
strategy. Because
Of
legally
course she
speaking,
did.
they were advising people to trespass.
Within 3 days
So
of the
I made my
signs
next
going
move.
up,
The following
the
Monday
HOA
morning,
sent out
I
a long
contacted a property
neighborhood
attorney.
email
Not because
titled,
I wanted a fight,
"Important
but because
update
if the HOA
regarding
wanted one,
Silverwood
I wanted
Lake
everything documented
access."
properly.
I got a
2 days
copy
later,
forwarded
official
to me
letters
by
went out.
3
Not
different
angry
neighbors.
letters, not threatening ones.
The message
just
claimed
clear,
the HOA
professional
was
notices explaining a
reviewing
few
legal
simple facts.
options
Silverwood
and
Lake was
advised
privately owned
residents
property.
to
The
continue
shoreline and water
normal
access rights
recreational
belong to the
use
property
until
owner.
further
Unauthorized
notice,
use could legally be
which was
considered
an
trespassing.
interesting strategy,
And beginning the following weekend,
because
Access
Legally
would require written
speaking,
permission from the
they
owner,
were
which, of
advising
course,
people
was
to
me.
trespass.
The reaction in the
So I
neighborhood
made
was
my
immediate.
next move.
Not everyone
The
was
following
angry.
Monday
In fact,
morning,
most people weren't.
I contacted
Many
a
residents had no
property
idea
attorney.
the HOA never actually
Not
owned the
because
lake
I
in the
wanted
first
to
place.
fight,
They'd simply believed
but
what the
because
board had
the
always
whole
told them.
wanted
But
one.
Karen was furious.
I wanted everything
That Saturday morning she showed up
documented
again,
properly.
this time with 2 other
days
board members.
later,
They walked straight down to the
official
shoreline where I
letters
was,
went out,
once again,
not
fishing
angry
for my chair.
letters,
Karen
not
crossed her
threatening
arms.
ones.
You're punishing the
Just
entire neighborhood
clear,
because of one
professional
fine.
notices
I shook my head.
explaining a
No.
few simple
I pointed
facts.
toward the sign.
Silverwood
I'm enforcing
Lake
property
was
rights.
privately owned
You can't just shut
property.
down the lake.
The shoreline
Actually,
and
I said
water
calmly,
access
that's
rights
exactly what
belong
private
to the
ownership allows.
property owner.
One of the board members stepped forward.
Unauthorized
Residents
use
have docks
could
installed
legally
along
be
the shoreline.
considered
I
trespassing,
noticed, I said,
and beginning
and
the
many have
following
boats stored
weekend.
nearby. Also
Access
noticed,
would require
Karen's voice
written
sharpened.
permission
So,
from the owner,
what are you saying?
which,
I leaned back
of
in my chair.
course, was
I'm
me.
saying
The
unauthorized
reaction
docks
in the
and structures on
neighborhood was
private shoreline
immediate.
can also be considered
Not
encroachments.
everyone was angry.
All 3 of
In
them
fact,
froze, because
most
suddenly the
people
situation
were.
looked very different.
Many
Fishing access
residents
was
had
one
no
thing,
idea
but docks,
the HOA
boats,
never
permanent structures,
actually owned the
that was a
lake
much
in
bigger
the
problem.
first place.
Karen
They'd
clearly
simply
realized it too. You wouldn't actually
believed
remove
what
them,
the
she
board
said.
had always
I shrugged.
told them.
That depends.
But
On
Karen,
what? On whether
Karen
the
was
HOA plans to
furious.
keep pretending they own
That
something
Saturday
they don't.
morning,
For the first
she
time
showed up
since this whole
again.
thing started.
This
Karen
time
didn't
with
have a
2 other
response.
board
The
members,
following week,
they
the
walked
HOA board
straight
held
down
an
to the
emergency meeting.
shoreline
This
where
time,
was
I didn't even need
once
to attend,
again.
because by then the facts
Fishing
were
from my
obvious.
chair.
They had fined someone
Karen
for fishing in a
crossed
lake
her
they didn't own.
arms.
They had
You're
encouraged
punishing
residents to
the
use property
entire
they had no
neighborhood
legal authority
because
over. And now the actual
of
owner
one
lived in the
fine.
neighborhood.
I
2 days
shook my
later,
head.
I received a certified
No,
letter
I
from the
pointed
HOA.
toward the
Inside
sign.
was a short notice.
I'm
The
enforcing
$600 fine
property
had been
rights.
fully withdrawn.
You can't
The
just
letter
shut
also
down
included a
the
statement
lake.
clarifying that
Actually,
Silverwood Lake was
I said
privately owned
calmly,
property, not managed
That's
by
exactly
the HOA.
what private
Funny how quickly
ownership
things
allows.
change when paperwork
One
shows
of the
up.
board
But the
members
best part?
stepped
2 weeks
forward.
later, another letter arrived.
Residents have
This one was an
docks
offer.
installed along the
HOA wanted to
shoreline.
negotiate lake
I
access
noticed,
for residents.
I said,
Fishing
and
permits,
many have
kayaking
boats.
access, boat use agreements,
Stored nearby,
all managed through
also
the actual property
noticed
owner. In
Karen's
other words,
voice sharpened.
they wanted to buy permission
So
to
what
use
are
the
you
lake they've been
saying?
regulating for
I
years.
leaned back
And
in
I'll admit, I did
my
consider
chair.
it, but not before
I'm
taking
saying
one last quiet morning to
unauthorized
sit by the
docks
water with my
and
fishing rod.
structures on
The sun
private
rising over the
shoreline
lake.
can
The
also
neighborhood
be
finally
considered
quiet. No
encroachments.
violation letters.
All 3
no
of them
HOA
froze.
rules. Just
Because
calm water and
suddenly
a
the
line drifting beneath the
situation looked
surface.
very
All
different.
because Karen decided to fine me
Fishing
$600
access
for
was
fishing
one
in my own
thing.
backyard. Sometimes
docks,
HOA power
boats,
trips end with arguments.
permanent
Sometimes they
structures,
end with court cases.
that was a
And
much
sometimes
bigger
they end with
problem.
someone accidentally
Karen
motivating the
clearly
wrong neighbor
realized it
to buy the
too.
entire lake.